All right, welcome. It is Thursday, April 30th at 3:01 p.m. Eastern Time, and this is the inaugural deep dive seminar. The first time we've tried this, extremely unstructured. We have a general topic, and that's all we're going to have. I'm glad to see I think we have like 12 people at least here, so I'm glad to see everybody here. If you've been to any of the newer groups of seminars, you will find that one of the things that we're doing is we are muting everybody and using the chat window exclusively for communicating back and forth. Chris is going to moderate that, so I'm going to mute everybody, and I'm going to unmute Chris as the only one so that he can go and communicate back and forth. But if you have questions, or responding to things, please put it in the chat window. All right, and we'll go from there. So, just to sort of start, the main topic of this deep dive, is the data designer, and so let's start with this. Have any of you actually used the data designer in configuration of ArcGIS Pro and setting up your projects, or even beginning to go and design your data structures? Let me make sure I've not muted myself. So I'm still available, right? You can hear me, Chris?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Because I know that Mark went and put something up and said that he wasn't able to hear me. Okay, good. All right, so has anybody used it yet, or kind of understand what it is? Should I just go for sort of the use of it? Go ahead, Chris.
We're getting a couple have never used it, so.
Okay. All right. Let's start with an analogy, and we'll move on from there. So inside of ArcMap, when we went and were attempting to go and start designing a database, we would go into Arc Catalog and create the file geodatabase, create the feature data set, and then we would create the individual feature classes. And with those feature classes, when we first go to add a feature class, it would allow us to go and say, okay, here's the fields that you want, and we would tell it what type of a field it was, whether it was a string field or a number field or a GUI, a global ID field or whatever it was. We would set up the original structure there. And then once we had it set up, then we could bring it into ArcMap. And at ArcMap, then we would have the capability of saying, okay, now I want to highlight this field, and I want to go and have this do this, and all of those settings and configurations and even the order in which we saw it, they were all over the place. It was just anywhere that it could fit. That's sort of the way the ArcMap interface was laid out. But with ArcGIS Pro, that's all been consolidated and expanded on quite a bit. So that if I go, for example, over to my catalog here, and I look at my database, and I go in here, and I can see here, if I right click on this, I can go to design, and it allows me to go to my fields, and it brings up the data structure that was originally used for my fields. All right. And I can see here what the actual field name is, what the alias is, what the data type is, whether or not it's allowed to have null values in it or not, whether it's required to have something in it. By the way, that's the previous, we used to call that required. And then whether or not it's got a domain on it. And if it's got a domain on it, whether or not there's a default value. And then finally, the length of that field. An interesting change that's occurred between ArcGIS Pro and and ArcMap previously is ArcMap always defaulted the text fields to 50, which if you've been around long enough, that used to be called the short text field inside of DBFs and inside of Access. They used to call that the short text field. And the long text field used to be more of a memo field. It was like 32,534 characters. Now with file geodatabases inside of Pro, it defaults to 255. So they've extended that short text out to the length, the maximum length that you have for characters. So often you'll find yourself sort of reducing that and bringing that in and making it shorter. But this is basically the beginning of the data designer capability on here. It allows you to go and add a field, delete a field, and such. But there's more to it than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and look at a layer that's been added to my map document. All right, I'm going to pull over first my text polygons, and I'll go to designer and go to fields. And what this allows me to do, and you'll see here a couple of more changes on here. There's a difference between pulling it from catalog and pulling it from a map. The difference is these first two columns here. Is that layer visible or is it not visible? All right, so here's where you set the visibility. Here's where you set whether or not this is read-only. So what I'm using here, by the way, is an ArcGIS Pro Parcel Fabric that has been completely version. There's been no changes to that at all. No configurations. This is the way when you go and do an upgrade from Esri, this is where they put it. This is what it looks like. Horrible, horrible. Nothing has been set whatsoever. So again, this is the primary configuration, and you can see that you have the object ID, you have your shape field, which is the geometry on here, and it goes all the way down through. You always have this here. And as you go through, from a designing standpoint, you then have the option to be able to go and modify certain elements of it. All right. So for example, on the stated area field, all right, I could tell it, I want to highlight that field. All right, when I come in here, I want to highlight the field. All right, and then this used to be over in, when you right click, you go to properties of the layer, it would say, okay, I want to highlight it. Now note when that happens, as soon as I make a change in this configuration, I see over here that there's a change that has taken place on here. And it will list all the changes that I've got, and then I can save them at the end, or I can just say, go ahead, don't save them and discard them. But as we go through here, for example, this is, in fact, the tax parcels from a parcel fabric. One of the things is the stated area. And if I look on here, come on. If I look here and double click on the right-hand area of the number field, it will tell me, okay, how do you want this number field presented back to you? All right, and I have a whole series of options. And again, I use the analogy that this is much like Excel. It's storing it as a number, but then you configure how do you want this thing represented back to you. And it can be as a percentage, or as currency, or as a rate. And a rate, by the way, is when you divide it by something else. So for example, maybe you had, and we'll do this before we get done, as a fraction or scientific notation, or as a direction, angle, or a custom sort of configuration. Well, this field itself here is just a stated area field, so it's just a number. But I don't want 6 decimal places. So I can go and say, well, I just want 2 decimal places on here. That's all I want. But I can also go and say, do I want it to be left aligned or right aligned? And traditionally, numbers are going to be right aligned. And I can say, go ahead and put the thousands comma in there to separate it out of thousands. I could pad it. I can have a plus or minus sign in here. And so let's just go and do that. Just that one simple thing. So if I go in here and save this configuration, when I now go in here and open up my attribute table, all right, I will see that that field now is highlighted, and it has been configured to only show me 2 decimal places on there. All right, so I can control what it looks like, where it is, and such. Well, let's look at that calculated acreage field here. Well, this is that calculated acreage field, and I can go in here and say, all right, well, let's again, by the way, that was calculated to 2. Let's go down to 2 on it. Let's show it as thousands, but this time I also want to show that to signify that this isn't just some number, this is in fact an acreage in here. So when I go ahead and change it, still nothing happens until I actually save that configuration. And then I have to reopen this. Excuse me, here. I am on the right one, right? Calculate. Oh, I forgot to highlight it. Yeah, okay. Now let's go ahead and open this again. And there I see the highlight. And I also see that it is configured now to go and give me not just the number that's in there, but also represent it with a suffix following it. Okay? So it allows me to go and in this case, more clearly represent what's actually included in there. If this was, and we'll go ahead and do that now. So this is now a calculated field. It had already been calculated to acreage, but I'm going to go and tell it, no, let's show this also a different way. Let's go down to the stated area field, which is here. All right. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to go to
Victoria wants to know: are the suffixes editable? I.e., can you add your own?
That's a really good question. I don't think you can, because it's not calling a domain. It's calling rather an embedded code in there. All right, and we'll talk about this here in a minute on there. Yeah, that really good question though. So let's go down. Let's do one more thing here. Let's go down and look at the shape area, and let's call this GIS acres instead. And notice I said acres instead of area because I want to calculate this out to something. That's actually square foot that's in there. Let's go and highlight it. Let's go over to the numeric and say, okay, we don't want that to just give us the number back. We want to do it as a rate. We want to go and calculate it, 43,560. Calculate the number of acres inside of there. And again, what is the decimal places we want? Do we want thousands on here? Now, when we do it as a rate, because we could divide it by anything, we actually have the ability to go and put a suffix in here. So I can go and put a space and then AC and then parens in there and say, go ahead and do that. When I hit save this, all right, I can now go in here to my attribute table and again go down now here, and now suddenly my square footage that appears in the shape file, or excuse me, that appears in the shape area field, now is being reflected back to me as purely it's calculated, it's a rate now. It's calculated and divided by 43,560, and then I've added a suffix on there. As with ArcMap, there's some little inconsistencies in the way this is implemented. So that, for example, when I do an identify on a parcel, if I go back here and do an explore on a parcel, let's go down the tax parcel here. All right, it does show it up there. That shows up there, that shows up here, that shows up there. But when I do a select or a query, I still have to put in the value that's stored in there. It's not going to be specifically how it's represented back to me. So that's consistently as it was in ArcMap. That's all the same in there. All right. So let's go in here again. And let's talk about, so are we kind of good with that, right? So here's some other things. For example, the object ID, for the most part, I really don't need to see that object ID, nor am I possibly using my subtype on there. But for example, I am going to use my name, and retired bys and created bys, those are important to the Pro Fabric, and area. This is the Stadia area units. Now, this is an area in which it's different between ArcMap Fabric and Pro Fabric. In ArcMap Fabric, the stated area, which is supposedly the deed acreage, the one that appears on the deed, was a string value. Now it's been converted into a number field. But in order to be able to go and figure out what it is, they now give you a separate field called the stated area unit field, right? That is, in fact, it has a domain associated with it. And when we look at the domain, it has everything from acres to square feet, square chains, everything in here. All right. So they provide you with all these things. So it's a number because this way they can start doing some calculations on it. They can figure out what it is by using both the stated area field. They can do an analysis between the stated area field and the calculated area field on those. They can analyze whether or not there's a variance between there, and they can actually begin doing things like contingency testing to say, or constraint rules that say, if you've input a stated area that's more than 5% above the calculated area, flag that as an error and say, no, there's something wrong here with that. So again, this is all setting the groundwork so that you can begin doing some analysis more and more of this, much more than you used to do on the ArcMap. The ArcMap was concerned with the boundary definition. This is more concerned about the attribution associated with this and whether or not it's in full compliance. So, but here's the interesting part. If we go and we are now on the area where we can look at not just in Data Designer, not just the actual field configuration, but we can look at the domains in here also and see all the domains in this database. And if we scroll down, and here is the area units here. All right. Now, if we note the area units and the area units field, the stated area units field on that polygon feature class is it's a long integer field. Well, if we look, here's the codes that they use for all of these. All right. So to answer your question, Victoria, is it editable? The answer is you could. You want to be careful though, because they might overwrite this later. One of the things that you might do is you could say, well, I don't use meters, so I can remove hectare and square meters and all these other things. I would just say be careful with that. Be careful with that, because you could do that, but again, you're never sure whether or not an update is going to completely overwrite your data model on there. All right, so I can tell you, Brian and I have been doing a lot of work with this, and we basically have memorized. Square feet is 109,405, square acres is 109,402. You begin to memorize those elements in there, just to make sure that you know what's actually happening here. Because some of this is built in, some of this you get to decide what you're going to do. All right. So what I wanted to do is show you there, you've got not just within this data designer, the ability to go in and configure the fields, but also you have access to domains and other elements in here. I'm going to close this off right now, all right, and go back to here, because I do want to go and show you something else. So is there any questions with that? No. So I could have said, well, let's set this to acres as our default value. The downside is, even though it's set as a default, it doesn't appear. You still have to go and check it as you go every time, no matter what. All right. So I can go in and save this. I've got these here. I've got, well, let's save this here. All right. By the way, I turned off my subtype here. Let's just turn that on real quickly. All right. So if I go back here now to my taxes and open up the attribute table, I will see a slight change in what it looks like. My object ID is gone. Here's my shape field. Here's my name field, my subtype, my created by field, my retired by fields are both highlighted. And then here's my stated area. Here's my acreage units. And here's my calculated fields on here. All right. So let's explore. Well, maybe I wish to go and establish parcel subtypes. Parcel subtype is a field inside of the Pro Parcel Fabric that isn't really used right now. They've assigned it to you and said, okay, it's available for you if you want, but they really don't use it. So what I want to do is sort of go through the data designer to show you how you might use it. We've already established that from the data designer, you can both design the way it looks together with domains are, what those domains are. So now we have parcel subtype that I've highlighted. It is a number field. It's a long integer field. And in here, I can see, is there a current domain that I can use? Is it maybe parcel type? Nope. I'm going to go and actually create a new coded value domain for this. And I'm going to call this PF Panda Parcel Type. I could help if I put a D in there. Not after it. All right. And that this is now and a type of parcel. Long integer, coded value domains. So it's all set, but there's no values over here. So over here on the left, on the right-hand side, I have the ability to start establishing values. Because this is a long integer, these values have to be numbers. So I can say, well, 1 might be a deeded parcel, right? And 2 might be, and I'll just pull out different types of deeds, maybe a trustee deed, trustee's deed. 3 might be special warranty deed. 4 might be a quitclaim deed. All right, so I can go on through all of these and
You
figure
type
out.
3 twice.
I did, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering why it was red. Why is it red? It's telling me there's an error in there. Now that I said, okay, now I have valid values in there, now it says, okay, there. By the way, not only did it show red here, but over here, it said, you can't save this because this isn't valid. All right, so you can't save this yet. Now I can go and save it. This is saving it in the geodatabase. I'm here. Any questions yet?
None yet.
Okay. By the way, if you actually look through here, I don't see any domains for that would be applicable to those suffixes in those number fields. I don't see any. So it's got to be hard coded inside of there. So writing the domains back obviously does take a lot more time than just making a slight change in the field. All right. Now that I've written back that domain, let's get it go all the way. Come on. Okay. Now if I go back here, here it is here. There's the type, and I can go in here and set the default. Maybe these are default to deeded parcels instead. And now I can save this. So in many ways, the ArcGIS Pro ability to go and do the background work of designing your data, setting up the schema, configuring it after the fact, not just before the fact, and changing how it's presented to you is much different than it used to be in ArcMap. So now let me go in here and let me go and where is it here? Here, let me just create a parcel. Just create a polygon and check and see. And stated area. Which one of these? Oh, I'm sorry, I was on the wrong one. Sorry. I wanted to go over here. Again, on this one, I'm actually working on the same data set, but 2 different configurations. So let's try this again. Let's go in here. here, go here, and it's not in there. It's not in there as that. I'm not quite sure why. But notice by default, none of these things get calculated. So even though we've set that the stated area should reference back to us a certain acreage, and the stated unit should be a certain acreage or a certain unit, and the calculated area should be there, by default, none of this at all gets calculated. It's just there. We get the shape area, that's always there, but the rest of it is all up to the designer to go and determine what is automatically calculated and what is not calculated on there. All right. So let's go and leave this. So that the question is, well, what do we do with this? How do we design this? And usually, if I were to bring that up, I would go here to my selected record and I would say, okay, let's calculate the area of this. All right. So I'm actually going to go and calculate the area of that parcel. All right. And I'm actually going to use Arcade instead of using Python. Nope, not there. Let's check that. Okay. So Brian, is that right? So this is an Arcade expression to go and calculate the area of the selected polygon and input or return back acres in here. So let me go ahead and run this, and you will see it just ran and returned back that this is 0.18 acreage on here. I could also go and say, well, instead of that, I think that's the abbreviation. Nope, it's not. Nope. There we go. If I didn't want it to be returned, if I didn't want to calculate what the acreage was, but I instead wanted to calculate the feet, I'd go and tell it to run that, and it would give me back the square footage instead. So again, there's, by the way, next month we're going to go into Arcade a whole lot more, but I can tell you Arcade is really cool. So let's go and change this back to acres here and say, and just check that. So there's our acreage on there. All right. So now that we know when we create something, it doesn't automatically execute that. Perhaps we want to go and set up a way that it automatically will execute that every single time we create something. All right. You good so far? All right. So then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to copy this so that I get it right. And now going in here, going back over to my field definition, I'm going to say, you know what? I don't want to configure this. Instead, I want to go and set up an attribute rule. And an attribute rule here, an attribute rule, there's three different types of rules. There's one that calculates things, one that constrains things, and one that validates things. All right. Let's focus as much as possible on the calculation rule. Calculation rule will go and think of this as attribute assistant on steroids. All right. And let's call this rule calc acres. Calc acres. And it can be set against subtypes. In this case, we have no subtypes on there. So the question is, what field is it going to calculate? And we're going to have it calculate that calculated area field. All right. Now, what's the calculation? And this could be a full, by the way, this is arcade. And if you actually look here, it must be arcade. It cannot be VB, it cannot be Python, cannot be any of those. This is arcade that this is using. So then it has to say, okay, well, what's the arcade expression to go and calculate this? So there's my expression. If I went here, by the way, I would have the full editor and I could build it myself and say, okay, and verify that it's correct. Do I want an error message popped up? Because inside my arcade expression, I can tell it that if this is happening, do this, and if this is happening, do this, but if not, do this. Throw off an error. I don't want an error message here. I just wanted to calculate that field to whatever it is. And then finally, what is my trigger? What do I want that thing to go and run every single time? Do I want it when I first insert that or when I create it? The answer is yes, I want it anytime it's created. But what about when I update it, when I go and modify it, modify not the attributes, but the shape of it? Then I can say, yeah, go ahead and do that. All right. So it's green, everything is good, and I should be able to save it. Oh, shoot. Why can't I save this? I can't save it because over on this map, I had an edit that I did not save yet. So I have to save that edit. All right, so I have nothing left in my edit cache at all. Then I can go back here and now I can save it because my edit cache is cleared out. So I will tell you, you will do this constantly. Whether you're working on the fields designer, whether you're working on the attribute rule designer, or any of the others, you will make it and you go and put this in place, and then suddenly you realize I didn't save my edits on there, so I cannot go and save this. So I'll go ahead and save it. All right. So if I go back to my map document now and go to create, go back down to here and create a new parcel. All right, and go to my attributes. Then suddenly I see that it has automatically calculated for me that area. And if I go in here and edit these, and then go back here, it automatically modified that and recalculated what the acreage is for that on here. And again, by default, none of this happens, but you can set up an attribute rule to do that. So let's go back. So we're going to stop here. Any questions yet? Any questions? I'm jumping around here, but I just want to sort of introduce some some initial concepts to you and go from there. Nope. Okay. So let's move forward again. So here I'm back on the data designer with my fields for my tax polygon layer. All right. And what I want to do is make sure that I recognize what I'm actually working on. All right. Because the data designer works in two different modes. One mode where I actually have the layer inside of a project that I'm working on allows me to go and tell whether or not the layer is visible, whether it's read-only, what the aliases is as far as the presentation, whether it's highlighted, whether or not, what the format is that's presented back. These are all presentation modes. This is how you want that data presented back to you. But if I look up here, there's actually a pull down, and this says, oh, maybe you don't want to look at the presentation mode. Maybe you wanted to go and modify somehow how that data is actually structured or stored. So if I go to my data source, you'll note it looks differently. It doesn't have the highlight, doesn't have the visible, doesn't have the the required, doesn't have any of those, doesn't have any configurations. If I go to any of those number fields, I can't set how it's presented back to me. It is only what is the configuration or what is the schema that I'm working on. So you want to be careful where you are editing these things and recognize that something you do in one side won't necessarily affect the other. For example, I can tell you that I went to one client's office and we spent a day customizing their data. And by the way, this was an old ArcMap Parcel Fabric. And so we went a day and we went in there and we said, we don't want this layer. So we deleted it. Delete that layer. Delete that layer. We don't want that. We don't want there's no unclosed polygons inside here. Delete that. Right? What is the complete parcel ID? No, don't want that. Don't want that. All right. By the way, I have edits here. This is telling me I have edits. Let's go ahead and save those edits. And then go back here. Now I can go and save it. So now I can go and save this thing and get rid of those layers, get rid of those fields. Right? They're done. Gone. Well, if I go in here and this is 2.5. They may have fixed that. They may have fixed that because now these are no longer showing. Yeah, because previously if you did something on the layer, it didn't necessarily delete it from the other. So I guess it is working now. So if I do something in my presentation, it also will do it backwards. All right, interesting. All right, so let's continue to sort of look at customizing this and exploring a little bit more what you can do with the data designer. So on here, I have a secondary attribute because this client uses this tax parcel ID as the real identifier. They go and they do an ETL out of this, and they use that tax parcel ID to go and join their CAMA system, right? So they want to maintain that. They want to make sure it's maintained all the time. So we can go and take this and move it, because I'm now on the presentation level, I can move it up to here and say highlight it. All right. Matter of fact, if I'm smart, I'll probably go and move this one up too and highlight them both on there. Why don't I also go and take the other one and highlight that and then save this out? All right. Now, if I go back to my map here and do an identify again, here, I will note that it's now gone and moved everything in the order that I set up for the presentation. All right. So again, remember in this field one, I'm not really editing the schema as much as I am setting up how I want this to be presented back to me, back to my users. And how am I going to make it convenient? Because there's a whole lot of stuff in here that they really don't want to see. They don't need to see, a lot of this in here, these sorts of things. So that's what I did in here. But in thinking about it, if the way this is configured right now, they'd have to go and put something in here and then copy it and putting it into here. Maybe I could configure it using an attribute rule that when they type something in here, it automatically copies it into the tax parcel ID so they don't have to do it twice, right? Simple thing. So let's go over to an attribute rule here. And let's add an attribute rule that says copy the name value and copy name value. And we want to go and take and use that to calculate the tax parcel ID. And again, I'm going to use Arcade. I'm going to just double click on here and it's going to say, Arcade basically is saying the $ feature means whatever feature you're working on, whatever feature is selected, take the value that's in the name field. That's sort of the notation that Arcade has right there. And if you note the last time with the calculate acreage, it said return the area of the currently selected feature, $ feature, in the format that I have in quotes, which in this case was acres. This time it's just saying take the value that's stored in the name field and paste it into the tax parcel ID field. And the trigger is anytime it's created or anytime it's updated. And let's go ahead and save that. Now I have a trigger on there for both insert and update. So I wonder if it works here. So if I put test, oh, it automatically calculated over to test. All right. So the update trigger worked. What about the new trigger? If I create something new, let's go in here to create. And let's go down here again. Tax parcel, create a polygon. There it is there. Go to my attributes layer. Anything I put here, yep, it's going to go and do it. If I really thought about it, if I wanted to, I could make that attribute rule, that calculate attribute rule, do anything I wanted. We've got clients that all they want to do is they want to put in the parcel ID. Well, it turns out that the web map has a search query string that we use an Arcade expression to go and calculate that query string, and it takes whatever they input, does the modification, puts it on the end of it, and automatically calculates these other fields for them so that they only have to type that value in once. And that calculate string can include everything from putting the URL components in there to adding dashes and spaces and anything else you want. It's just a calculation. Whatever you would do with your normal attribute calculation, that's what it does. All right. It also calculated, by the way, that calculated acreage for me or calculated area for me and automatically put that in. So the data designer at this space, because we just used really simple calculate rules in here to go and do this. The key to this is understanding where the triggers are and understanding arcade and how to go and get arcade to work. All right. So what else can we do with this? What else can we modify with this? Or what else should we be designing with this? Do we have any questions on this yet? You all ought to have a whole bunch of questions by now. You really should.
Nothing yet.
Nothing yet. Is anybody going to use this? Or is it just something that I think is cool? You know? Yeah.
Kelly says yes, definitely going to use.
Okay. So far we have gone and done one layer inside of our map. And by the way, that one layer is only in this one map. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's been configured for this map. By the way, this is the same data set, but this is something that we've already configured for working within the Pro Parcel Fabric. And just sort of to show you here, I think this is a configuration that we've set up. Some of these layers are turned on, some of them are not turned on. If I go in here, and we also have a calculate attribute rule already preset on this so that as it runs, it will go and calculate things for there. So again, you want to go and understand how things work on here, and the fact that yes, out of the box, this is not configured, but it is open and flexible, and you can do anything you want with this. All right. Mark says, does any changes permanently save changes on the data set? I heard a rumor that we still cannot use this to change field orders in the underlying data set. Field orders. Mark, can you expand on that a little bit, or do you want to get unmuted? I'll unmute you, Mark. Go ahead. Oh, sorry. I'll send that unmute request.
Yeah, Frank, I was just wondering if we can use this to permanently adjust the field order in the underlying data if it's connected to a shape file or file geodatabase or whatever it may be.
That's a really good question, Mark. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so let's go back to our data designer for the fields on here. And we said I went and modified this and changed the order in which these fields are presented back to us. All right, and this is the text for the map. All right, so I went and did that. But if I go and look at the data source itself, where is tax ID? It's still here, still way down there. So the question is, and this is sort of one of those holy grails that we would like to be able to go and take and move this? The answer is no. This cannot be done. Literally, it cannot be done yet. I say yet, hoping that at some time in the future, as we will recognize that we do want to be able to go and manipulate that structure. But I understand from Esri's standpoint, this is not trivial. This is a lot of work. I can tell you, I can share with you that when we used to use personal geodatabases, I would go into Access and just change those orders in the Access file, and that worked perfectly. But with a file geodatabase or enterprise geodatabases, you cannot do that. You literally have to go and rebuild this as you go, as you're doing this. All right. So by the way, let me show you something really, really interesting on here. And I'm going to sort of mess up with this for a while, but I want to show you that while I'm in here, let's close out this attribute rule. This is for this one map document here. Let's go over here. And this is one of the things that's really interesting. If I go in here to another feature class, and this could be, I'm starting with my new data where it's going to reside, and I've got my old data where it's going to reside. So let's assume these are supposed to represent the same thing. Let's go and put these next to one another. So I can go in here with the data designer and say, okay, here's my old schema, and I want to take these columns, I want to take these fields, I'm going to highlight them, and I can say copy them. And then I want to go over here to my new stuff and just say paste them in here. All right. And it will copy and paste that schema and put it into my new schema for me. So I don't know how many hours I spent going and trying to get schemas to match between pre-ArcMap Parcel Fabric and ArcMap Parcel Fabric, because one of the things that often you had to do is you had to go and make sure that all the extra attribute fields got pulled over into the delivery. And again, I spent an awful lot of time copying the properties, pasting it over here, copying the properties, pasting it over here, and adding fields to the Parcel Fabric schema. The data designer lets you go and copy schema from one end and put it into something else, and it will give you a warning if that already exists. So if I were to go in here and say, let's take this type field and copy that and paste that in here, it automatically renames it, doesn't let me do it. It won't let you have the same thing in there twice. All right, but from a data designer standpoint, this is close. We're getting close to nirvana. If we could do as Mark suggested, be able to actually change the order, not in the presentation, but in the actual schema, then would be in nirvana, but not right now. This is still, it's got to be the order in which it is, which means that all of these default attribute fields that Esri sticks in there, you can't put something before it in the actual schema. Good question. Thank you for reminding me, Mark. Yeah.
Robert asks, you can use X-ray, right?
You know what, Robert? Since you have this, in a lot of ways, X-ray is sort of superfluous. You really don't need it. It's so much easier now to actually go in there and make schema changes and to make changes in the presentation that you may not need as much. I mean, X-ray, what it does is it goes and analyzes the schemas between the two and allows you to integrate them. You can still use X-ray, but it's going to have to be X-ray at the ArcMap level, because I don't think that Steve has rewritten X-ray for ArcGIS Pro yet. I don't think so. But you can move fields between schemas, yeah. And you can move them in the presentation elements of them, but it doesn't really do a comparison yet. Interesting. I haven't talked to Steve in a while, and I know he was talking about Pro, but I don't know whether he's actually done anything in there. Yeah. All right. So we've gone over some simple elements in here. What else can we do? What else can we do in here? We had said that. Oh, let's look and talk about. We talked about polygons. Let's talk about individual lines in here and the designs on the individual lines. All right. The lines feature class and the differences between the old ArcMap Parcel Fabric and the lines and the Pro Parcel Fabric. We've talked about a couple different times now, a couple different seminars, the fact that they have changed from string values for the COGO fields to numeric values. And again, this is because they want the ability to go and do calculations between them so that you could do, literally, you could set up a validation rule that says, make sure that the COGO distance is not more than X number of feet difference from the actual shape length. So you can do validation on this. You can do validation on here that says, if I have a polygon that has a traverse associated with it, if that traverse doesn't close, don't let me build that parcel. Right? These are sort of elements that can get built into the attribute rule. But let me go on here and say, okay, so the bearing field, the direction field is actually now a number field, and it is number field with north azimuth displayed as quadrant bearings, and you tell it how many decimal places you want to put it. The distance field is, right now we've already set this to 2 decimal places on here. Oh, I'm on working map. Sorry. Let me go back over here to this one. Again, just to show you, you can have different settings between different maps. So here, this is a direction, north azimuth quad's good. Here's number field. By default, it comes out with 6 decimal places. You want to set it to 2, and you want to put it here. Radius, 2 decimal places, thousands, 2 decimal places to thousands, and you go on and on and on. You also can set it so that while you're looking at these, you get to highlight these on here. The COGO type field, I don't think we've talked about that much inside of here, but on the line feature class for the Pro Parcel Fabric, you have a field which allows you to go and set where the COGO values were derived. Now, again, you don't even need COGO values on lines anymore inside the Parcel Fabric. But if you do have them, you have the ability to go and set where it was derived, whether it was entered from a description, or whether it was from geometry, or whether it was computed. So that the from geometry really means inversed. All right. When you first come in here, you inverse. When you have it selected and you do an update COGO, that's from geometry. The first option entered means I typed it in from a deed. The second option means we inversed the line and basically it's the same as the shape length. The third option, computed, means that I went and clipped this. And when I clipped it, it calculated what the difference between the original distance was and what remains on there. And if I had a distance value in the distance field, it went and used that. It didn't proportion necessarily the overall length, but used the actual distance on there to go and calculate that. So that's what you got here now with the COGO field on here. So let's go and highlight that also. Created by record still there. I don't, oh, I've got some edits here, don't I? I do have edits I haven't saved. Let's go ahead and save this. Let's go and open this. See what it looks like on what we had. Here's my created by records. Here's my direction, my distance, my radius. Here, these are 2 decimal places. COGO type has been set to nothing yet, so we haven't set that. Here's an interesting field. This parcel ID field actually appears to be a leftover, a remnant from the ArcMap Parcel Fabric. Within the original ArcMap Parcel Fabric, the lines used to be sort of the core for relating things, and they had a parcel ID which pointed over to the object ID of the parcel. It's not used anymore. It really isn't. It's an appendix. It's not there anymore. And so we might think about just sort of hiding this field or deleting it. By default, the Pro Fabric has it in there right now. Not quite sure how they're going to use this though. All right. So let's see what else we can talk about on here. I don't want to go too far into this here. We talked about, let's go and open up the attribute rules on here. All right, on this one, it has nothing. An attribute rule, there's 3 different variations. There is a calculation field on here. So the calculation field, as we've demonstrated, when you create it or when you modify it, it will go and spawn off a calculation. That calculation can be any sort of arcade expression. It can just purely calculate things out, or you could actually have it drill down into other layers to pull values out of those other layers and store them into an attribute field on your current feature that you're building. So you could have it go and drill down and say, okay, what section is this parcel in? And it will go and drill down. What subdivision is it in? So you could actually build the various components of the attribution of a tax parcel by using arcade expressions and just have it go and do that. All right, those are just some of the things. The constraint rule is basically, it's used to go and have a rule set in place that gets fired off and determines whether or not a certain condition is met. If that certain condition is met, if it's true, it goes through and lets you do it. If it's not met, it gives you an error on it. It doesn't do anything other than giving you an error. So this is the constraint rule is where you would set a constraint, for example, where if this has a traverse on it and that traverse doesn't close, give an error warning. Don't prevent it from happening, but give you an error that says this didn't happen yet at all. This didn't happen, so you couldn't do that. Or if the acreage, the deeded acreage and the stated area and the shape area is beyond a certain range, go ahead and give you an error message saying something's happened. Again, it doesn't stop it, it just goes and produces an error message. I can tell you that we're sort of experimenting with this with as it relates to control points. Because control points are now basically just regular fabric points, but they have an attribute set called isFixed. And it allows, so if it's a control point and shouldn't move, it's got an attribute saying it's fixed. If not, then it's just a point. Well, we're experimenting with constraint rules that say that if you have a control point that you're attempting to move, it should give you an error message and say, nope, you're not allowed to do this, and it won't let you do it. So again, we're going through it and looking and seeing how constraint rules could be applied and what's the best practice on those. And then finally, there are validation rules. Validation rules are a little bit more stringent. So for example, in the sample that Esri uses, is that let's say I have a series of polygons in there and I have points that I'm inputting, and the points are only allowed to be in certain polygons and not in others. Well, I can validate whether or not that point is inserted into that polygon. Again, part of this arcade script to be able to go in and drill down through and say, which polygon is this in? Is it in a polygon or is it not in a polygon? And if it's not in a correct polygon, if it's not working the way it's supposed to do, don't even let this thing happen. Don't worry about getting an error, just don't let it happen. So there's sort of three different gradations of what happens on here. Calculation rule, just do it. Boom, do it. Constraint rule, give me an error message if this happens. And then validation rule, either do it or don't do it, but just sort of prevent it from going on and doing any more work. I'm trying to think. These things are really, really strong. And again, if anybody's ever used Attribute Assistant, it took the whole concept of Attribute Assistant and put it on steroids. And it's because this is stored in the geodatabase. Once you set an attribute rule against a feature class, that goes with the geodatabase. That doesn't necessarily mean every single person has to have it set up for them on their individual machines. I think I've gone over everything that I wanted to go over on this. So let's open up to see if anybody's got any questions on here. I don't hear anything. I don't see anything.
Nothing yet.
All right. So with that, I think I'm going to go and just sort of ask a couple questions and then sort of stop the recording. So this deep dive concept, to me, has always been a very intriguing concept because it goes and covers things a little bit more depth than you would traditionally be able to do in a seminar or 1 hour sort of forum. I suspect it's worthwhile, but I'm not quite sure. I think it's worthwhile. Let's start with that question. Is this worth doing on specific topics? Sort of going through and saying, okay, well, what about these things, Frank? And what about, what about those?
We're getting a lot of absolutely's, definitely yeses.
Yeses.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the easy part. I mean, I could have made money on, I could have made book on that, right? Everybody's gonna say, yeah, do this. Now here's the tougher part. What subjects would you like to take deep dives into? That's where it's going to be tough. So what would you like to learn a lot more about that isn't being touched elsewhere? That's what we need to do. That's what we need feedback on. Like I said, next month, arcade, because we definitely, I can tell you internally, we have a lot of interest in arcade. And while we kind of can fumble around with it, we can figure out how to do certain things. We are not experts in arcade. And we're going to bring in a friend of mine, Ned Cake from Tallahassee, Leon County GIS. And he does a lot of arcade. And we're going to have a whole bunch of questions for him. So let's see what we got here. Kelly says customizations, what the software can do, things you shouldn't do, and arcade. And Kelly, can you expand a little? I'm going to unmute everybody here. Kelly, or at least allow you to all unmute yourself. Kelly, can you express a little bit more what you mean by that? Not just the customizations, because there's always little customizations you can do with Pro. But specifically, I mean, things like,
right.
Are you talking about customizing the ribbon, customizing the gallery? What are you talking about on there?
Yes, all of that. Just those kind of like tips and tricks, those little nuances they use in the software that they don't show you in a class, a typical like Esri class or a basic class, you know, they don't show you the things, the nuances that you found out or other people found out about using the software and what it can and can't do and kind of things, tips and tricks, that kind of thing. That's the stuff I want to see.
Yeah, I no doubt about it. I'm thinking about it. Customizing the ribbon, definitely. You know, customizing the tool gallery, customizing the ribbon, customizing the quick access. All of that I think is a good one. We can do that. You know, tips and tricks. I usually go and share that as much as I can with a certain subject as I'm going over it. I can tell you a challenge, and I kind of laugh about this, but I know it's serious. When I'll be going in and teaching somebody, or I have somebody in a class, and they'll say, "Well, okay, so Frank, so tell me what I don't know." I'm like, what? Well, yeah, it's hard to say because there is so much in here, and I often know that we have a very diverse audience, and some people are just getting new in this, and some people have been in it for a while, and some people are spelunkers. You know, I'm a spelunker. A spelunker is a cave explorer, someone who's not afraid to go in and just dive in there and go and find everything you can out about the software. And so some of us are spelunkers and some of us aren't. So I'm not quite sure what level you could be at. But you know, I appreciate Kelly. I think you're right. I think we do need to do something like that. And I'll be looking for more and more suggestions. Go ahead.
Well, as a side to just as a side to that, I know that even just in some, you know, learning, like let's say certain types of processes, like we don't use a lot of utilities, and that kind of editing and so forth. But even if you showed things you've done or projects people have done specific, it helps you learn about how the software works. Not necessarily maybe something you're going to actually use that exact process, but just being able to see how it works and how it really lives and breathes, so to speak, because it really helps for me to see those demos and to see that kind of stuff in action. I get a lot more out of that than, you know, telling you the terms and telling you, you know, the specific book stuff, so to speak, you know, how they want to have it canned out of the box for you for learning.
Right. And that's, you know, believe it or not, that was always one of my goals for the Parcel Fabric Forum. And I think we've been somewhat successful with that, in that we've got people to share one another projects and the way they solve certain questions that all of us have. And so I would say I'm more than happy to go and do it on interesting things that I do. But I'm as interested in finding out the interesting ways that you have solved your problems. So if we're going to do something like that, I'd like to get other people to, and again, I'm going to do this next month with the deep dive and get Ned to go and show you some of the really cool stuff he's been doing with Arcade to just sort of, blow it up and say, okay, here's a cool thing I did to sort of light one another's fire and say, oh, I can do that now. And you're right, it does have to be, but it's not just Frank, it's not just Panda. We've got to go and be able to share with one another on there. Yeah.
Rod says deep dive on editing tools and examples of each.
Yeah, and I definitely am going to go and begin exploring in the other two seminars, the pro editing one, which is next Thursday is the pro one. We're going to start introducing the editing tools, and on those, I am going to dive pretty deep on each of them as we go through. I'm not just going to go and say, here's this tool and this tool and this tool. We're going to sort of give a deep dive on it. That means it's going to be slower running through the tools, but it's going to give you more depth on them. And you're going to have more capabilities in there as far as how to go and do that. Definitely. Tori, thanks. Thanks. Mandy, you were saying LSA, least squares adjustment. Yeah, first of all, least squares adjustment is not in Pro yet. Not in Pro. While it is in ArcMap, Kelly, I'm sorry to do this. We're going to ask you, Kelly, how does Frank feel about least squares adjustment for parcels? Do you remember?
Not positive.
I don't like it.
I remember you said, yeah, you didn't like how it worked at all.
Yeah, well, it's not just how it works, but that whole concept of least squares adjustment is fine in certain instances. For example, if you're dealing with performing a least squares adjustment on the public land survey system because you have survey information about it. But the problem with and performing a least squares adjustment on a subdivision to see if you can isolate the individual errors or sort of the redundancy that you might have in certain elements inside of a subdivision. Yes, but against a set of tax parcels is not the data set to do it against, because a tax parcel is different. A tax parcel comes from discrete descriptions, all right? And each of them describe property differently. And again, I use this one example. Let's say that you have a section corner and you have a legal description that is defined an aliquot description that says the north 1,000 feet of the west 200 feet. All right. That legal description does not rely upon all the other corners in that section for its placement. It relies specifically on two lines. And a least squares adjustment will go and take the error and spread corrections across between the control points that are utilized in the network, so that a description that has an aliquot description, such as the north 1,000 of the east 200, would get adjusted with a least squares adjustment. And in fact, it should not be adjusted unless those two lines or those two monuments that it's dependent upon also get adjusted. And that's a problem I have, is that least squares adjustment is purely a mathematical adjustment that's applied to observations, but it doesn't take into account that parcels are described differently. A legal description is a design, and that design isn't necessarily valid because of just, again, aliquot description. That's one way. Okay, you shouldn't do those. Meets and bounds description. A meets and bounds description, the bearings and distances called out in that meets and bounds description are not really where that corner is located. That corner is located according to where the original monument was placed, so that you have variance between what's recorded as the bearing and distance of a line and where the actual property corner is. All right, as a surveyor, I use a meets and bounds description to get me into the general areas so I can find a monument. But that monument, the odds are, it does not exactly match that bearing and distance. So it's not the bearings and distance which locate the property corners. It is the monuments that are pointed to by those bearings and distances. So, and you can tell this is one of my soapboxes. So you should never, ever, ever apply a least squares adjustment to a tax parcel database that has been derived from legal descriptions. And I'll preface this by saying, at least in the United States, because yes, there are other places that can use coordinate values to go and locate lands, but not in the US. US still uses a very antiquated system which relies upon interpretation of that legal description to find the original monuments. And the reason why I called on Kelly is Kelly has heard me say that many times. I mean, I passionately lecture my Wisconsin friends and clients. Don't think that just because you get good meets and bounds descriptions that that's actually a valid location of where that property is. I'm going to get off my soapbox and do it. So Mandy, yeah, I would love to do this. Once 2.6 and actually 2.7 comes out, you'll have a better idea of how to do LSA inside of Pro. Let's hold it off till then. And I won't get on that soapbox again for a long time. So sorry. I do get passionate about that. Yeah, Rod, definitely we're going to go into the editing tools and examples of each and how to use them. Yeah, definitely. And Mandy, thank you. Thank you. So we are just about at the end of the hour and a half. All right. So I'm going to, oh, Nancy's suggesting a deep dive on surveys, good versus bad. Information on plats would be interesting too. Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting topic. So how do you tell a good survey from a bad survey? How do you tell a good legal description from a bad legal description? It's a great one. I don't know whether that is purely related to ArcGIS Pro or GIS or anything like that, but maybe we can think about doing a deep dive on that. I have done some lecturing on that. I did a lecture one time to Chicago Title about that very subject. So we might do something like that. Anyway, hopefully, again, because this was the inaugural one, hopefully you found this interesting, informative. Hopefully I didn't waste an hour and a half of your time. So what I'm going to do is introduce another concept that Chris and I and some of the other people were talking about. And I'm going to begin introducing this in every one of our seminar series. And that is office hours. All right? And I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'm going to open up office hours.
All right. Thanks for attending, and we hope you enjoyed this workshop. If you have questions, would like some more details about anything we discussed during this workshop, or if you or anyone at your organization would like information about training, support, or ways in which we can help you with your GIS needs, please contact me at frank@pandaconsulting.com or call me at 561-691-3277, and we can discuss how we can help you with your needs.